The 27th of June, 1938. A sharp, insistent ringing sounded in a Moscow apartment on Konyushkovskaya Street. It broke the silence, foreshadowing trouble, as was often the case in those years. NKVD officers stood at the door. They were polite but unyielding. A short arrest warrant, a quick but thorough search. They confiscated very little: personal papers, drawings, books. For 31-year-old Sergei Korolev, one of the leading engineers at the Jet Propulsion Research Institute, the world collapsed overnight. He was charged under Article 58 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR, Paragraph 7, undermining state industry for counter-revolutionary purposes, i.e. sabotage, and 11, any kind of organizational activity aimed at preparing or committing counter-revolutionary crimes. In the atmosphere of the Great Terror, such charges were tantamount to a death sentence. The country lived in a state of paranoia, searching for enemies of the people. Any failure in production, any technical malfunction, or simply a conflict with a colleague could be grounds for denunciation and arrest. The RNI, where the first Soviet rockets were developed, was no exception. The institute was torn apart by internal intrigues and the struggle for resources, which created fertile ground for the repressive machine. The basis for the arrest was testimony extracted from his colleagues who had been arrested earlier. The interrogation of another prominent designer, Valentin Glushko, played a key role. Under pressure from investigators in the torture chambers, he signed a protocol stating that Korolev had deliberately delayed research work and wasted state funds on unpromising projects. Glushko would later claim that this testimony had been obtained under torture. But back then, in 1938, it didn't matter. The flywheel had been set in motion, and it demanded more and more victims. The investigation was conducted using methods that became the hallmark of the era. Interrogations could last for days without sleep or food. The investigators demanded one thing: a confession to something that never happened. In one of the letters later sent to Stalin, Korolev described how he was beaten, breaking his jaw. On 27 September 1938, exactly 3 months after his arrest, a session of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR was held. The trial was a formality. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp, with 5 years deprivation of political rights and confiscation of property. His first place of detention was Butyrka prison in Moscow. Then came a long and painful journey. First, he was sent to a transit prison in Novocherkassk. The conditions there were inhumane. Cells designed for 20 to 25 people held 150 to 200 prisoners. People slept standing up, suffocating from lack of air. It was there that Korolev first encountered scurvy and dystrophy. But that was only the beginning of the journey. The final destination in his accompanying documents was a word that made even the most desperate people's blood run cold: Kolyma. In the spring of 1939, he and thousands of other convicts were loaded into the holds of a steamer sailing from Vladivostok to Magadan. The voyage itself was torture: cold, hunger, seasickness, complete uncertainty ahead. Finally, on 21 April, the ship arrived at Nagaev Bay. They were greeted by an icy wind and the harsh land of permafrost. From there, Korolev was sent to the Moldyak gold mine, lost in the taiga. It was one of the most deadly places in Sevastopol, the northeastern correctional labor camp.
Это
The
было одно
engineer,
из
whose
самых
thoughts were
гиблых
fixed on
мест
the stars,
Севастополя,
was given a pickaxe
северо-восточного
and a
исправительно-трудового
wheelbarrow. His
лагеря.
task was to
Инженер,
extract
чьи
gold for
мысли
the
были
country that
устремлены
had
к
declared
звездам,
him an
получил в
enemy.
руки кайло
His
и
dream of
тачку.
space was
Его
replaced by
задачей
a
стала
daily
добыча
struggle for
золота для
survival,
страны,
for an
которая
extra
объявила
ration
его
of
своим
bread,
врагом.
for the right to
Мечта о
simply live
космосе
to see
сменилась
the next
ежедневной
morning.
борьбой за выживание,
Life at the
за
Moldyak
лишнюю
mine
пайку
was
хлеба,
reduced to the
за право
simplest
просто дожить до
animalistic
следующего
instincts.
утра.
Every day was like the one before, consisting of monotonous, exhausting labor. They got up at 5 in the morning, had a meager portion of gruel, watery soup with a few grains of cereal or frozen fish, and set off for work. 12 and sometimes 14 hours a day, Korolev and thousands like him, enemies of the people, hammered away at the permafrost. In winter, when the temperature dropped below 50 degrees, the metal of the pickaxe burned even through gloves, and exhaled vapor instantly turned into frost on eyebrows and eyelashes. In summer, a short but turbulent period was replaced by an invasion of gnats, clouds of midges and mosquitoes from which there was no escape. Korolev, a man of intellectual labor, accustomed to the drawing board and complex calculations, was thrown into the thick of physical labor. He hauled wheelbarrows with rock weighing up to 100 kilograms across rickety wooden planks. Any awkward movement threatened a fall or injury, and in the conditions of the camp, any serious injury was tantamount to death. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The camp doctor could only offer aspirin for all illnesses, and those who weakened were simply written off and sent to so-called recovery barracks from which few returned. It was here, in Maldyak, that Korolev fully experienced what it meant to be a dohadja. This camp term referred to a person in the final stages of exhaustion, when apathy and indifference to everything, including one's own life, completely took over the consciousness. He lost weight, his face became gaunt and covered with scurvy sores. His teeth were loosed and fell out one by one. In his memoirs, which he shared only with his closest friends and family after his release, he recounted how once, exhausted, he fell and could not get up. He lay in the snow, realizing that this was the end. Death seemed like a release from torment. Salvation came in the form of another prisoner. It was Mikhail Alexandrovich Usachev, former director of Moscow Aviation Plant No. 22. Usachev, himself convicted under Article 58, had somehow retained some of his influence and authority even in the camp. He recognized the emaciated Korolev as the talented engineer he had known briefly on the outside. Realizing that Korolev would not survive the general work, Usachev secured his transfer to a lighter position, first as a quotas officer and then to the camp administration's Design and Engineering Bureau. It was not freedom, but it was life. Instead of a pickaxe, he had a pencil. Instead of an icy mine, he had a relatively warm barracks. This allowed him to survive physically and, equally important, to keep his mind clear. Meanwhile, a desperate struggle was being waged for him on the outside. His mother, Maria Nikolaevna Balanina, knocked on the doors of every possible authority. She wrote letters to Stalin, to the new head of the NKVD, Lavrenti Beria, and to the chief prosecutor, Vyshinsky. She did not believe in her son's guilt and, methodically, with a persistence that only a mother's love can give, proved the absurdity of the charges. Her efforts were not in vain. People whose names were known throughout the country became involved in the case. The famous test pilots and heroes of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gromov and Valentina Grizodubova, played a key role. They knew Korolev personally as an outstanding designer of gliders and aviation technology. Their authority was enormous. At the end of 1939, when the wave of Yezhovism began to subside and Beria began to purge the NKVD apparatus of its most odious figures, there was a faint hope that some cases would be reviewed. A letter signed by Gromov and Grizodubova and addressed personally to Beria fell on fertile ground. In it, they vouched for Korolev as an honest Soviet specialist whose knowledge and talent were extremely necessary for the country's defense industry. The order to review the case and transfer Korolev to Moscow arrived in Kolyma at the very end of the 1939 navigation season. And here fate played another cruel joke on him. He made his way from the depths of the Kolyma taiga to Magadan, but was too late. The last steamer to the mainland had left just a few hours before his arrival. Navigation was closed until the following spring. This meant another winter in the cursed land. Staying in Magadan, he found work in the medical unit, which may have saved him. He had a roof over his head, received at least some food rations, and was not engaged in hard labor. It was not until the summer of 1940 that he was finally able to board a steamer bound for Vladivostok. The return journey was no less difficult, but now there was hope ahead. Upon arrival in Moscow, he was again placed in Butyrka prison. A new trial took place. The sentence was changed. Instead of 10 years in Kolyma, he was sentenced to 8 years in a correctional labor camp to be served in a special technical bureau. This is how Korolev ended up in the famous Sharashka. He was sent to NKVD's Central Design Bureau No. 29, located in Bolshevo near Moscow. It was a completely different world compared to Kolyma. Here, behind barbed wire and under guard, were gathered the best minds in aviation science, declared enemies of the people.
This prison design organization was headed by Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev, who was himself a prisoner. The conditions were incomparable to those in the camps: normal food, clean linen, the opportunity to do what they loved. But it was still a prison. Every day, the imprisoned engineers went to work under escort and returned to their cells in the evening. Korolev joined the work on the P-2 dive bomber project, which was being developed under the leadership of Vladimir Petlyakov, and the Tu-2 frontline bomber, the brainchild of Tupolev himself. He proved himself to be a talented and energetic designer. However, his thoughts were still occupied with rockets. In 1942, he and a group of other specialists were transferred to another Sharashka, OKB-16 in Kazan. Here, fate brought him together with the man whose testimony had sent him to Kolyma, Valentin Glushko. The meeting was difficult. Two geniuses whose paths had diverged so tragically were now forced to work together in the same prison cell, at the same drawing board. They were part of the same project, the creation of rocket boosters for combat aircraft. This was needed at the front, and personal grievances had to be put aside. This period became a test not only of their professional qualities, but also of their human qualities. They were able to establish a working relationship, but complete reconciliation never happened. The rift that had formed between them in 1938 remained forever. Their further cooperation in the space program would be marked by constant conflicts and struggles for leadership, which would repeatedly jeopardize important projects. The Kolyma experience changed Korolev forever. He was physically broken. His lost teeth had to be replaced with dentures. His heart was irregular. His jaw, broken during interrogations and improperly healed, caused him constant discomfort. It was this injury that would play a fatal role in 1966. During a routine operation, surgeons were unable to insert a breathing tube into his trachea due to the deformation of his jaw, which led to cardiac arrest. Thus, the echoes of the 1938 interrogations caught up with him almost 30 years later. But psychologically, he had become a different person. He had become tougher, more secretive, more distrustful. He learned to survive in any environment, to find common ground with both criminals and party officials. He understood how the system worked and learned to use its rules to his advantage. He became an unrivaled organizer, capable of pushing through any decision, no matter how bold, and convincing generals and ministers that he was right. He knew the value of time and the value of human life. He was in a hurry to live and work, as if afraid of not having enough time. His famous exactingness towards his subordinates, his iron will, his ability to take on enormous responsibility, all these qualities were forged and tempered in the icy hell of Kolyma. When the world heard Yuri Gagarin's call sign in 1961, few knew that the man behind this triumph, the chief designer whose name was kept secret, had gone through all the circles of hell in Stalin's Gulag. The case that was supposed to destroy him ultimately created the Korolev who was able to lead the country to space victories. The system tried to break him, and it did break him physically. But it could not break his spirit and his dream.
If that old man from the Maldiak mine had not survived, if his mother had not shown miraculous perseverance, if the famous pilots had not put in a good word for him, if he had been late for that steamer by just one more day, the history of space exploration could have taken a completely different path. Gagarin's flight is not only a triumph of science and technology, but also a monument to the unyielding will of a man who went to hell and came back to reach for the stars. He paid a terrible price for this dream, and that price was measured not only in years spent behind barbed wire, but also in decades of ruined health, which ultimately cut his life short at its peak. This meeting in Kazan was not just a clash between two people, but a clash between two philosophies of rocket engineering. Glushko was an advocate of liquid rocket engines, LRE, running on high-boiling, self-igniting fuel components such as nitric acid. He saw in them the future, power, reliability, the possibility of multiple ignitions. Korolev, especially at that time, was fascinated by the idea of winged rockets and rocket planes, and also saw enormous potential in solid fuel and oxygen kerosene engines for large rockets. This technical dispute, which began while they were still free, took on a bitter taste of personal drama within the walls of the Kazan Sharashka. Now they had to not just argue, but create a common cause on which not only the country's defense capability depended, but also their own fate. Any failure could be interpreted as a continuation of sabotage and cost them not only their freedom, but their lives. In this atmosphere of paradoxical co-creation, where genius was confined by prison walls and personal hatred was subordinated to the needs of the state, Korolev showed himself in a new light. He did not just perform calculations, he delved into the essence of production organization in conditions of bondage. He observed Tupolev, how this titan, deprived of everything, continued to lead a huge team, how he obtained the necessary materials and equipment from the guards and NKVD authorities. It was an invaluable school of management in extreme conditions. He saw that authority based on knowledge and unyielding will could be stronger than prison bars. The lessons learned at CKB-29 and OKB-16 would form the basis of his own leadership style, which would later be called authoritarian, harsh, but phenomenally effective. His release came in July 1944. It was not complete, but early, with the removal of his criminal record, but without full rehabilitation. The war required specialists, and keeping engineers of such caliber behind bars was becoming an unaffordable luxury. Korolev walked out of the gates of the Kazan prison, but remained working at the same OKB as a freelancer. He was free, but the stigma of being an enemy of the people remained with him invisibly. Full rehabilitation, due to lack of evidence of a crime, would only take place in April 1957, 6 months before the triumphant launch of the first satellite. Until that moment, the man who headed the most advanced and secretive branch of Soviet industry was formally considered a former state criminal. The Kolyma experience also left its mark on his character. Those who knew Korolev before his arrest remembered him as an energetic, enthusiastic, sometimes quick-tempered, but generally open and friendly person. He returned from the camps a different man. He became much more withdrawn, learning to hide his true thoughts and emotions behind a mask of stern, businesslike efficiency. He developed a harshness that sometimes turned into cruelty. He brooked no dissent, demanded the impossible from his subordinates, and did not forgive mistakes. His famous phrase to the designers, "You will do 120%, not 100 if you want to survive," did not come out of nowhere. He himself had gone through a situation where superhuman effort was required to survive, and now he demanded the same from others in order to achieve his goal. He became suspicious, especially of those involved in his work. He never forgave Glushko. Their further joint work on the space program turned into a series of hidden and overt conflicts. Korolev as the chief designer of the rocket and Glushko as the chief designer of its engines were linked by a single chain, but constantly pulled in different directions. This antagonism reached its peak during work on the N-1 lunar rocket, when Glushko's refusal to make powerful oxygen-kerosene engines for it forced Korolev to take a risky and, as it turned out, disastrous decision to use a cluster of 30 less powerful engines designed by Nikolai Kuznetsov. Many historians of cosmonautics believe that it was this conflict, whose roots go back to the interrogations of 1938, that was one of the main reasons for the USSR's defeat in the moon race. The camp taught him something else too, to value every minute. He worked 16 to 18 hours a day, without days off or holidays. He was in a hurry, as if trying to make up for the years stolen from him. This rush was dictated not only by the race with the Americans, but also by an inner feeling that he had little time left. He intuitively felt that his health, undermined in Kolyma, would not allow him to live a long life. Korolev's tragedy was part of the general tragedy of Soviet science. The repressions of the 1930s decapitated the Jet Propulsion Institute. Its founders, Ivan Klymanov and Georgy Langemak, were shot in 1938. They were the true fathers of the rocket projectiles that would later become the famous Katyushas. Valentin Glushko went through prisons and the Sharashka. Dozens of other talented engineers and scientists were either destroyed or written out of life for many years. Soviet rocket science was set back a decade. It was only thanks to the titanic efforts of people like Korolev, who managed to survive and return to work, that it was possible not only to restore what had been lost, but also to surge ahead. The connection between his personal tragedy and Gagarin's flight is not artistic exaggeration, but a direct chain of cause and effect. It was Korolev, with his unquestionable authority and unique organizational talent, who was able to unite the efforts of hundreds of design bureaus, factories and scientific institutes to create the R-7 launch vehicle and the Vostok spacecraft. He personally supervised the training of the first group of cosmonauts and interviewed each of the candidates himself. His word was decisive in choosing who would fly first. He chose Gagarin. On 12 April 1961, at the Baikonur launch site, it was he who gave the final commands. His voice in Gagarin's headphones was the last voice from Earth before the rocket lifted off from the launch pad. If his life had ended at the Maldiak gold mine, if he had not survived that terrible winter of 1939, history might have been different. Perhaps someone else would have led the Soviet space program. Perhaps that person would not have possessed the iron will, strategic vision, and ability to take responsibility that Korolev had. Perhaps priorities would have been set differently, and instead of breaking through into manned spaceflight, the country would have focused on military or applied tasks. The race for supremacy in space could have been lost. Thus, every day Korolev spent in Kolyma was a day stolen from the future of cosmonautics. His survival and return became the miracle that gave humanity the era of space exploration. His story is not just a biography. It is a parable about how a system created to destroy an individual can unwittingly temper that individual to such an extent that they become capable of changing the world. But it is also an eternal reminder of the monstrous price that had to be paid for the stars. That price is broken destinies, ruined health, and scars that never heal. Scars left by the icy winds of Kolyma on the heart of the chief designer. Inside the Sharashka itself, a special life of its own was boiling, full of drama and absurdity. The imprisoned engineers, stripped of their names and titles, wore camp numbers. Korolev was prisoner SK. However, behind this faceless label lay a world of complex human relationships. Here, in this closed space, old scientific disputes were exacerbated, and new alliances and antipathies arose. Tupolev, himself a prisoner, enjoyed unquestionable authority, not only among the Zec prisoners, but also among his prison superiors.
He could sharply reprimand an NKVD colonel for the late delivery of duralumin or demand better food for his designers, citing production needs as justification. Korolev eagerly absorbed these lessons. He saw that even in a completely powerless position, it was possible and necessary to fight for one's cause, using any means available. Letters occupied a special place in the life of the Sharashka. Correspondence with relatives was strictly limited and censored, but it was the thin thread that connected the prisoners to the outside world, to their past lives. For Korolev, letters from his mother and wife, Ksenia Maximilianovna Vincenzini, were a source of enormous moral support. He waited for them eagerly and reread them many times. In his replies, which were restrained and cautious, he never complained. He wrote about his work, assured them that everything was fine, and asked them to send him books on advanced mathematics, theoretical mechanics, and aerodynamics. Even in prison, his mind continued to work on the problems that had preoccupied him when he was free. He was not just serving his sentence, he was preparing for a future that perhaps only he believed in. There were moments of despair, long years in prison, the lack of clear prospects, separation from his family. All this weighed heavily on his psyche. Sometimes, as his cellmates recalled, he would become gloomy and withdraw into himself for several days. But then his inner strength would prevail. He would sit down at the drawing board again, argue with his colleagues, proving his point, and generate new ideas. It was in the Sharashka that he finally formulated for himself the concept of multi-stage ballistic missiles as the only means of achieving space speeds. This idea, conceived in a prison cell, would form the basis of all his future triumphs. His return in 1944 to a world that had continued without him came as a shock. Moscow was different, military, harsh, but free. He carried the invisible burden of his past. Many old acquaintances avoided him, afraid of compromising themselves by associating with a former enemy of the people. His marriage, which he had tried so hard to preserve, began to crumble. The long years of separation and the changes that had taken place in him had distanced him from his wife. Soon they divorced. His personal life, like his health, had been sacrificed. After the war, a new chapter in his life began. In 1945, already with the rank of lieutenant colonel, he was sent as part of a group of specialists to defeated Germany to study German rocket technology. It was an irony of fate. A man whom his own state had accused of sabotage and working for foreign intelligence was now officially engaged in collecting the most advanced and secret technologies of the enemy. It was there, examining the remains of Wernher von Braun's V-2 rockets, that Korolev became finally convinced that he was on the right path. He saw that the Germans had come close to solving many of the problems he had been struggling with since the 1930s. But he also saw their mistakes. He realized that the Soviet engineering school was capable not only of copying, but also of surpassing German achievements. This period became a real renaissance for him. He threw himself into his work. Based on captured technology, the first Soviet ballistic missile, the R-1, was created under his leadership, an exact copy of the V-2. This was followed by the R-2, R-5, and, finally, his main creation, the R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile, the famous 7. It was this missile that would launch the first satellite, Laika and Gagarin, into orbit. While creating this formidable weapon, Korolev always kept his main dream in mind. He designed the 7 with excess power, sufficient not only to deliver a nuclear charge to another continent, but also to launch a payload into space. He deceived the military, convincing them that such power was necessary with a reserve. This reserve opened the way for humanity to the stars. But even at the height of his fame, although his name was classified, he was a legend in narrow circles, the shadows of the past did not let him go. He was terrified of doctors, especially after one of them, recognizing him, exclaimed, "Sergei Korolev? And I thought you were shot in 1938."
Every medical examination was a reminder of prison infirmaries and a broken jaw. This phobia would lead him to postpone the heart surgery he needed until the very last moment. His management style remained a reflection of his camp experience. He created a system within his OKB-1 that worked as a single, well-oiled machine subordinate to his will. He established the Council of Chief Designers, an informal body that brought together the heads of all related enterprises involved in the space program. At these meetings, he could be harsh, he could shout, he could bang his fist on the table, but he always got the decision he wanted. He didn't ask, he demanded. He knew that in their business, any small detail, any oversight could lead to disaster. He remembered the price of mistakes. In Kolyma, it was measured in human lives. In space, too. And yet, behind this armor of harshness and authoritarianism, there was a dreamer. Boris Chertok, one of his closest associates, recalled how once, late in the evening, after another exhausting meeting, he walked into Korolev's office. Korolev was sitting at his desk, looking out the window at the starry sky, and said quietly, "Just think, someday, apple trees will bloom on Mars." At that moment, he was not the formidable chief designer, but the very same Sergei Korolev who, in his youth, built gliders and dreamed of flying to other planets.
The dream, which neither the NKVD investigators nor the Kolyma frosts could kill, continued to live in him and drive forward not only himself, but the whole country. Thus, Korolev's story is not just a tale of broken health and a hardened character. It is a story of how one unyielding will, having gone through inhuman trials, was able to change the course of history. The case that was supposed to wipe him out in the camp ultimately gave him the energy and fury that proved necessary for the breakthrough into space. Without Kolyma, there would be no Korolev as we know him. But at what cost? That question remains open. The answer lies in the timeless grave near the Kremlin wall, where he was laid to rest at the age of 59, and in the triumphant cry of "Let's go," which might never have been heard without him. The journey to Kolyma was a separate, methodical process of dehumanization. In the overcrowded holds of the Indigirka steamer, where political prisoners and hardened criminals were mixed together, their own wolfish laws prevailed. Korolev, an intellectual and engineer, found himself in a strange and hostile environment where physical strength and camp experience meant everything, and academic degrees and past achievements meant nothing. There was not enough air, and food, salted fish, and a minimum of water had to be fought for. It was a plunge into primitive chaos, where every day one had to prove one's right to live. He saw people go mad with despair, die of disease and exhaustion before even reaching shore. This experience left an indelible mark on his mind, teaching him to instantly assess people and situations, to distinguish real threats from apparent ones. He understood that survival was only possible by fully mobilizing his inner resources and abandoning illusions. His arrival in Magadan brought no relief. The icy wind of Nagaev Bay only confirmed that he had entered a world where nature and human cruelty had formed an alliance against him. Even in the relatively vegetarian conditions of the Kazan Sharashka, the reality of prison life was a constant reminder. The intellectual battles that raged over the drawing boards took place under the supervision of guards, for whom all these geniuses were nothing more than enemies of the people carrying out an important state task. The absurdity of the situation reached its peak when the designers needed logarithmic rulers or reference books for their calculations, and to obtain each of these trifles they had to write a request to the prison authorities. It was in Kazan that Korolev and Glushko, putting aside their personal animosity, worked on the creation of the RD-1 liquid rocket engine for installation on the P-2 aircraft. This project became one of the first practical steps towards the creation of powerful liquid rocket engines, which would form the basis of future rockets. The disputes between them were fierce but productive. They could shout at each other for hours, arguing the merits of different turbopump designs or fuel compositions, and then sit down in silence and make corrections to the general drawing. This forced collaboration was a unique school of compromise and scientific opposition in conditions where the price of a mistake was not just a reprimand, but a new deadline. After his release, Korolev faced an invisible wall. His loss of rights meant that he could not live in large cities or hold leadership positions. At first, he was a nobody, a talented engineer with a stigma that everyone shunned. His career would have been impossible without patronage from the very top. The key figure who saw him not as a former prisoner, but as a genius, was the young People's Commissar for Armaments, Dmitry Ustinov. It was Ustinov who, risking his own career, began to promote Korolev, entrusting him with the most responsible tasks.
He managed to convince Stalin and Beria that this was the man needed to create the country's missile shield, with his fanatical dedication to the cause and unique knowledge. Korolev repaid this trust 100-fold, working with superhuman dedication. He understood that, unlike others, he would not be forgiven for a single mistake. This status of conditionally forgiven forced him to be a cut above the rest, one step ahead of everyone else. He had to constantly prove that the country, which had nearly destroyed him in the camps, had not made a mistake in bringing him back to work. His famous Council of Chief Designers was a direct result of this experience. He did not trust the formal bureaucratic hierarchy, where responsibility was diluted among dozens of departments. He created his own parallel power structure based on personal authority and personal responsibility. At council meetings, he brought together all the chiefs, for engines, Glushko, for control systems, Pilyugin, for radio systems, Ryazanski, and forced them to make and sign joint decisions. Each of these people was a titan in their field, ambitious and powerful. But Korolev was the only one who could make them work as a single orchestra. He did not allow references to objective difficulties or colleagues. "I don't care why it's no, I care what you will do to make it yes," was his leitmotif. He took final responsibility for everything, but demanded the same absolute responsibility from each of them for their own area of work. This system, forged in the fire of distrust of formal institutions and based on the iron will of one man, proved incredibly effective for solving breakthrough tasks, but it was fragile and completely dependent on Korolev's health and life. He built a pyramid with himself at the top and did not prepare a successor, perhaps subconsciously understanding that his unique experience could not be replicated. The severity of the sentence weighed not only on his shoulders, but also on those of his family. His wife, Ksenia Vincenzi, instantly became the wife of an enemy of the people, which condemned her to social isolation, loss of employment, and constant fear. Their daughter Natasha grew up practically without knowing her father, seeing him only during rare, brief visits through prison bars, which were only possible in the Sharashka, a special prison for political prisoners. This personal tragedy, the breakdown of family ties, was an integral part of how the system broke a person, striking at those most dear to him. Even when he was given the opportunity to work in his profession, he remained a cog in a monstrous machine. At Kazan OKB-16, his specific task was to develop and introduce into serial production URM rocket boosters for P-2 dive bombers. It was exhausting work, where the slightest mistake could be considered sabotage. He did not just draw, he fought for every gram of weight, for every second of thrust, knowing that the lives of pilots on the front line depended on his calculations. This experience of survival and working under pressure taught him the art of mimicry. He was forced to disguise all his subsequent activities in space exploration as military needs. When he proposed to Khrushchev that they launch the first satellite, he emphasized not the scientific breakthrough, but the opportunity for reconnaissance and to demonstrate superiority over America. He became a brilliant manipulator, using the fears and ambitions of the Politburo to advance his cherished dream, turning the Cold War into fuel for his space rockets. Even his release was not a celebration. When he walked out the gate, he felt no euphoria, only emptiness and the realization that 6 years of his life had been erased forever.
His freedom was conditional. For a long time he felt invisible surveillance and understood that any wrong move, any failure, could send him back behind barbed wire. This constant life on a knife's edge became second nature to him, forcing him to work with triple energy to prove his right not only to work, but to life itself. Sergei Korolev's story reminds us how political repression nearly destroyed the chances of a breakthrough into space. He survived, but paid with his health, and his return saved the dream of the stars. This period is not just a page in his biography, but a warning about how easily we can lose geniuses capable of changing the world.